Hi there. This is going to be a video in which I talk about sprites. Now, sprites are fundamentally the kind of images that we use in a game to visually display almost everything. Um, so most importantly, I guess, sprites are either static images or they can potentially be animated images with kind of frame-by-frame animation. So most obviously things like, the player's character on the screen that moves around, or walls that the player has to navigate around, or a background image, etc. All of these things can generally be referred to as sprites. Obviously, we don't have to make games that rely on sprites and visual imagery. We could make audio-only games, for example. But sprites are so fundamental to so many forms of game creation, as well as other experiences, that it makes a lot of sense to understand how Phaser 3's sprite system works. And that's what we're going to do right now. So if a sprite is an image that we want to display in our game, we are going to need an image to display in our game. And there are lots of ways, of course, that we could obtain an image. But what I would like to do is make one from scratch. And to do that, I'm going to go to use an app called Piskel, which is a really nice free online editor for animated sprites and pixel art. It's a surprisingly fully featured pixel art application that exists online and does a really good job of being what it is. In particular, it's very nice for drawing simple pixel art and for making pixel art animations, which we will do kind of in the second half of this lesson. For now, I'm not going to sign in or anything. I'm just going to create a sprite. And what I want to create is a wall that's going to exist in this game that I am sort of hypothetically making. The game that I'm making is kind of like not the important thing. What I want really is something that I can display. So you can see it's got the standard kind of drawing tool stuff over here. I'm not going to talk too much about that. But I'm going to use, I think I'm going to use, what am I going to do here? Goodness. I'm going to use the line tool. I'm going to use this kind of 2-pixel pen size here. And what does a wall look like? Kind of up to you. I'm going to say that, oh, this is the other thing that I would like to do. One thing that's useful when we're drawing sprites, certainly especially simple sprites for Phaser 3, it's quite a good idea to draw them in white. So I'm just changing the foreground color to white there. The reason for that is that if I later want to tint the color of my sprite to some other color, oh, he said, zooming uncontrollably in and out, it's easier to tint a sprite that's white than a sprite that is not white. So like from here, I don't know, like, I mean, obviously I can sort of do whatever. I don't know what a wall looks like any more than the next person. But let's say that a wall looks like this kind of 2 inset squares thing. That's what we're going to get. Okay, so that's my wall. I've drawn a wall. I could fill the background here if I felt like it. I'm just going to leave it semi-transparent. That seems kind of appealing to me. And so now I would like to get this sort of out of Piskel and into my game. So where do I do that? I do it over here. So I've got a few options here. What I am going to do is export. So I'm going to use the Mountains and Sun export tool. I'm going to click on that. And I don't know which of these tabs it begins on, but I'm going to want to export as a PNG file. And the easiest thing to do is I'm going to use the sprite sheet file export. Now, a sprite sheet we'll talk about a little bit more later in the context of an animation, but really a sprite sheet is this idea of an image that we use to create sprites from. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to download that image. And you can see it downloads as a file called newpiskel.png. So my new PNG, oh, let me delete that. I don't need that anymore. There's my new PNG. I can open it up and see my nice wall. And I'm going to rename this to wall.png because that's what it is. And I'm going to head over to my windows here, and I'm going to need somewhere to put it, right? So I'm inside my project here. It's called Game Engine. And I'm going to make a new folder called Assets, and in there a new folder called Images. And that's where I'm going to put my new wall. So I'm going to drag it over into there. So now I've got an image of a wall. It's 32 by 32 pixels for what it's worth. And it's now in my project structure, right? There it is there. So it's an assets images wall.png, and there it is. Lovely. So that's image creation. Piskel's just a nice tool. Well, as I said, we'll use it again for some animation in a moment. But it's a really nice little piece of technology that we can use. So we've got the file. How do we add it into our actual game? As a sprite, right? The sprite is the thing that's in our game. Currently, what we have is an image. Now, there are lots of ways of going about this, in terms of the specifics, but it's pretty clear, I think, that we're going to want to do this at least in part, in our boot class, right? Because the boot class is this thing that we said we were going to use to load all of our assets. And now we have an image that's an asset, so we're going to want to do something in here, but what? Now, for the sake of example, let's do this through a Phaser 3 example. So here's the Phaser 3 examples page. Now I know what I'm looking for, right? It's possible to find these kinds of things, obviously, just by browsing. But I know that what I am looking for is that I'm interested in the loader. So the loader is the thing that allows us to load other media into the context of our game. So I'm going to want an example of using the loader. And what I'm really looking for is just like, how do I load an image, right? So let's go and look for that. So audio, bitmap text, image. That's what I'm trying to load. So I'm going to click on that. And, this looks like the simplest example here, just load image. So I'm going to click on that example. I guess it worked, right? Because there's an image being displayed. This also seems kind of useful more generally for what I'm trying to do, because I'm trying to load an image and display it. So it may well be that this example has more of the kind of stuff that I want to do than just the loading aspect. So again, remembering that the way that these Phaser 3 examples are written is a little bit different to the way that our project is written, right? They are using functions here instead of the class structure that we've got. But the basic principle, fortunately, is the same. And the really important thing here that we get to see is that there's a function called preload that is being used to, you guessed it, preload the images. And we can also see that in there, we can see how they are preloading a couple of images here with this .load.image thing, right? So the thing that this tells us, and again, this will just become kind of just the ordinary thing that we do when we're creating a boot class, is that we actually need a preload method in our boot class. And because our boot class is the preloader for our whole program, this is the only place that we're going to need to have this preloading idea, right? So the preload method is where we load everything in our game. And we want to mirror the idea that they've got here. So here's a PNG that they are loading. So let's just copy this idea here. And I'm going to paste it in over here. I'm going to get rid of the single quotes because they make me feel annoyed or something, make my tail swish around. So there's two things going on in these parameters, which are kind of what the eye is drawn to. The first is a keyword, right? So this again is the same idea in Phaser 3, that every kind of media element or scene has a key name that we use to refer to it. So what's the key name for our wall? I'm going to call it wall. The second thing that we have is a path to a file. So their path is a little bit different to my path. So I need to make sure that I notice that, for example, my folder is not called pics, it's called images. And then we have the file name here, right? And my file name is wall. So this will allow me to load my image of a wall into my game with the key name wall. So how's that working? Again, we've got one of these kind of subsystems that Phaser 3 works in. It's a very modular library, right? So again, this refers to the current scene, which is the boot scene. And load, this .load, refers to the loading system that's available for loading all kinds of media into a Phaser 3 game. So the loading system is available in this .load, and it has a method called image, which is for loading images, which you provide with a key name and a path to the image. So by including our preload method with this loading instruction here, we are officially loading our image into our experience, right? So that's great. There's another thing now that we are actually loading something that we're going to want to do, because we can no longer just immediately start the next scene, right? Because we need to wait for this to finish. We don't want to start the play scene until the preloader has finished. So this line here is now no longer a good idea. So I'm going to remove it from create. So now all that create is going to do is display this loading message. And in preload, what we can do is we can listen for a specific loading event. And that event is the complete event. But let's go again and look at the examples just to have this experience of relying on the examples. So I'm still kind of interested in the loader here, right? This is the loader examples. And what I'm interested in, and I happen to just know that I'm interested in this, is what are the events that can occur with the loader, thinking to myself that one of the events that would be important to know about is when loading is finished, right? So that idea of loading finishing is the idea of an event. Now, there's a lot of examples here, again, and it can be a little bit difficult to know exactly which one to look at. Which one should I look at? Which one should I look at? I'm going to, so this one here, right, which is a file complete event, but I'm kind of wanting to know when all of the things are completed. So I'm going to look at this load progress one. I'm pretty sure that one has the kind of idea that I want in it. So there you go. So that's good, right? Because we saw there was like a loading bar and then all of the images displayed. So that seems like the right kind of idea. And indeed, here we go. So this gives us the kind of the syntax for how we can respond to a loading event. We have this.load, which is the loading system. And then just like we're familiar with from some other frameworks, we have this on method that allows us to pay attention to specific events. And we learn that one of those events is the complete event. So I am going to take this idea. I'm not gonna take all of this. I'm just going to take that idea of this.load.on complete. So what I want to say is in the preloader, this.load.on complete. So when that happens, I want to switch to the play scene because that will mean that all of my files are loaded, right? So how do I do this? I can't actually do it with a standard function. And the reason for that is what I want to do, right, is this.scene for the scene management system .start and then the play scene with its keyword, right? But I can't do this because inside an anonymous function, this loses its meaning. So there are different ways to avoid that specific problem, but the easiest way to avoid it in this kind of anonymous function context is that instead of using an anonymous function, we use an arrow function. And that's what I'm going to do here because this is such a little piece of code. So to turn this into an arrow function, I will delete the word function and I'll add the arrow there. So we have empty parentheses because we have no parameters, the arrow, which is telling us that it's an arrow function, and then the code that should be executed by this function, which is to switch to the start, which is to start the play scene, right? So overall, this is saying when loading is completed, when the complete event fires off, call this function that starts the play scene, and we can use this.scene here to refer to the overall boot scene because we used the arrow function. That's just a nice little trick. This is the kind of thing that you're gonna, once you've got this sort of technology in place, you'll just be using this for every project, right? So this is kind of boilerplate to a certain extent. So now our program loads the image, and then when that's done, it switches across to the play scene, which means that the image is ready when our play scene starts. So if we go over and look at our project now and reload it, it's so fast, right? Because it's just a 32 by 32 image. We still don't see the loading message because the file just loads so quickly that there's no load time effectively, or not. It's shorter than the frame length of our animation. So that's great. The file we assume is loaded unless something went wrong. Let's hope not. Now we want to know, how do we add a sprite into our game that uses that image? And to do that, the place that we're wanting to display that image is in our play scene over here, right? So how are we going to display it? Well, that previous example actually had what we wanted. Not this example, but the load image example. So let's go back and find that. So we're in the loader category again. We want to go through to image, and then we want load image. So again, that's how you load an image. How did they add that to the scene? We need to look down in their create function down here, which we will use correspondingly in our create method of our play scene. And here you can see, here's how they added an image into their scene. This.add, we're familiar with that. That's that idea of adding some kind of element into the scene, which we used for text earlier. This time we're using a different method called image. Clearly we've got a position and then we've got the key name of the image that we want to add. So let's replicate that in our play scene. So where do we do that? We'll do it, well, let's do it instead of this text. We don't really need this text anymore. We're not going to be relying on that. So let's add the wall sprite, one instance of the wall sprite into our program. So we're going to say this.add for the adding system, image this time instead of text. Where do we want to add it? Well, I'll add it at 100, 100. That's nice and simple. And what image do I want to use? Remember that we're using the key that was used in the preloader. So we loaded the wall image with a key of wall. So when I add images using that key, I add them with the key there. So we should, in this instance, then see our wall in our project. Oh, thank goodness. Imagine if we hadn't. But there it is there, right? So that's the nice thing that I drew in Piskel. It's been loaded in boot, and now it's being displayed by being added to the scene in our play scene. As you might imagine, I could do this more than once, right? I could add another one at 200, 100, and then I would have 2. Sure. Another thing that we're probably going to want to do is we're probably going to want to be able to refer to this wall in some way. Currently, I'm just adding it to the scene, and then there's no way for me to refer to it anymore. So it's very common, at least with any of the sprites that you want to do something with later, to assign them into a property of the class. So I can say this.wall, which creates a property called wall, and I can assign the result of adding the image so that I've got in this.wall a reference to that image. That's useful because then I can manipulate it in certain ways. So for example, just by way of example, there is on a sprite object, which is what this.wall is, right? Because this is creating a sprite here and storing it in this.wall. There's a method called setTint that allows us to tint it to a different color. And the way that we specify tints is with hexadecimal, but we write it out as a hexadecimal number instead of a string. So we have that 0x, that means it's hexadecimal, and then we have the hexadecimal string here, DD33333, which is kind of a sort of a pinkish color, right? Because it's higher in red than the other colors. So setTint is a method that is available because this.wall is a sprite. And here you go, you can see that it's been tinted that kind of pinkish color. That's why it's valuable to assign these things into a property, right? Because we may want to do something to it later on. Okay, so that is the process of adding a static image. The other thing that I want to talk about here is I want to talk about adding animated images into our game, because animation is such a it's such a classic part of making a 2D game. So the way that we most commonly or at least most easily create animations for video games is with sprite sheets. And a sprite sheet is a single image that contains kind of a grid of all of the individual frames of an animation, or maybe more than one animation. It's kind of like a film strip, right? Like it's got the motion frame by frame in a single image. And Phaser 3 can take a sprite sheet, load it in the preloader, and then we can kind of play those animations in our game in a fairly straightforward fashion. And so that's the process that I want us to look at now, so that we can add not just static images, but animated images. And to do that, we're going to need a sprite sheet. And so let's return to Piskel, good old Piskel, and let's create an avatar image. So how are we going to do that? Let me think about this for just a second. What's the avatar going to look like? I'm kind of freaking out here. I'm just going to get rid of all of this stuff. Actually, maybe I'm just going to click Create Sprite. That would make more sense. Close that one. Okay, so here we go. Let me think about this here. So I could make the avatar thing. Oh, that looks kind of terrible. I don't really like that. And I also want to work in white, remember? Because in case I want to tint this later on. I'm going to stick with squares. I think squares are probably my friend here. So the avatar is going to look like that. Now, that's one frame, right? But we want the avatar to be animated. So how do I turn this into an animation? I use the Add New Frame button here to create the next frame. And you can see already over here in the top right, the animation's kind of flickering, right? Because I've got a frame with the square in it, and now here I've got an empty frame. The other thing that you can see is that there's the outline of the previous frame here on my canvas. That's because I've got this onion skin option available here. So you can see it's got a picture of an onion the onion skin lets me see the previous frame at a certain level of transparency if I want to. I generally find it pretty helpful. So let me redraw, goodness me, that's not what I wanted at all. So let me redraw this one here, so that we've kind of got some stability around the edges. And then let me, what am I going to do? Goodness, Pippin, get it together. Get it together. Maybe I will do this. I'll do that. So this is not a good animation yet, but believe me, it's going to be incredible by the time I'm done. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the first frame, and I'm going to drag it down here, and I'm going to draw a stroke here, and I guess you can kind of see what I'm going to do. Now I'm going to duplicate the first frame and move it down to the bottom, and I'm going to draw a line here. I mean, that's kind of almost good enough, isn't it? What do you want from me? I'll keep going. I feel like I've started this, and now I'm doomed to continue this task that I've set for myself. So I'm just duplicating that first frame to get a kind of a blank square, and then I'm moving this line across. And this is, this is the nature of frame by frame animation. You've probably done this kind of thing yourself at some point in your life, foolhardily. Okay, there we go. So now we've got this kind of line that scans across frame by frame. I've drawn each individual frame of that, and you can see the kind of result of that is displayed here. I can change the frames per second that this is displaying at up to 24. Looks pretty cool. It's got some dynamics to it. It's got a kind of robot-y vibe to it. So that's good. So I've got an animation. Let's call that done. I don't want to get too obsessed. And again, I want to export it, and I want to export it in the same way that I did before, which is I click the mountainous export button. I go to PNG here, and I go Sprite Sheet File Export. Here you can see it's giving me some options, right? It's got 7 frames, and so it's saying it's going to display that as 3 columns and 3 rows, right? So there's 9. Technically, it's a 3x3 grid, and it's going to put the 7 frames into that 3x3 grid. So let's download that and see what that looks like. It downloads, again, as a file called new Piskel. And if I go over here and look at my new Piskel, I'm going to rename it to Avatar, right? Because it's my avatar sprite sheet, the thing I'm going to move around. And if I take a look at it, you can see probably what you expected, right? Which is the different frames of the animation are being presented in a 9x9 grid. Because there are only 7 frames, it doesn't take up the full 9x9 grid. But this is the kind of thing that Phaser 3 can read in and turn back into an animation for us when we add it to the game. So let's take a look at that process now that we've got our beautiful, beautiful animation. Okay. Oh, well, I need to add it to my project, or this is never going to work. So let me grab avatar.png and pop it alongside wall.png so that I can actually load it into my project. Otherwise, all is lost. So how do I load a sprite sheet as opposed to an image? Well, again, I need to think about this in terms of preloading first. I always need to think about what I'm loading. I can't load it just as a standard image because then Phaser 3 is not going to understand what it is. So again, if I'm learning this and trying to think about how to do it, I would go back to my loader examples. I'm going to head back. That's the image loading. And I'm going to look and see if it's got something for us about sprite sheet loading. There we go. So here's the sprite sheet category. It's almost as if I know what I'm doing. And we want to just simply load a sprite sheet, right? So I'm going to use the simplest example that I can see here. Oh, cool. That's way cooler than my animation. I'm feeling a little inadequate. I've got an exploding green thing. So how are they doing that is the big question, right? And here, again, we're talking about preloading, so let's look at their preload function to understand it. And you can see what you may have expected, which is that they're using the loader, but instead of image, they're saying sprite sheet, and they've got some kind of extra stuff going on here. So let's actually copy this loading thing and take a look at it in our own code. So after we've loaded the wall, we're going to paste this in. And you can see it's this.load.spritesheet, so this is the specialist sprite sheet loading thing. Again, we begin with a key, so I'm going to give this the key name of avatar. We need the path to the actual file. Mine is assets, images, avatar.png. And then there's some extra information, and that's because this is a sprite sheet, right? We can see that there's 3 important properties that we're going to want to think about. There's the frame width and frame height, which it needs, if it's going to slice up that single image into the individual frames, it needs to know how big an individual frame is. Our frames were 32 by 32, not 64 by 64, so I need to change that. And the other thing that it is potentially going to need to know is because the grid is not necessarily completely full with frames, we might need to tell it how many frames there are. So here it's asking us what is the final frame of the animation. And it's important to know that it's counting from 0. So the final frame, because I have 7 frames, is 6, the 6th, because the first frame is numbered 0. So end frame is 6, and now this will load up our avatar sprite sheet unless I made a mistake, which is, as we know, completely possible. We also know that we're not going to really see anything based on this because in order to use that sprite sheet, we're going to need to include it in our play scene. So how are we going to do that? Well, we added the wall in this way. Let's add our sprite in a similar way. Again, now that we know that we're going to do this kind of thing, it makes sense to create a property for the avatar, especially for the avatar, right? Because we know that we're going to probably want to move it around and check what's going on with it. So we definitely, when we add it, we want to save a reference to it. Now, we can't use this.add.image because it's not just an image. It is a sprite. And so we are going to add it as a sprite, like this. And then we're going to use exactly the same notation that we used for the wall. So I'm going to position it at 200, 200, and I'm going to provide the key, which is avatar, to the sprite sheet that it's going to use, right? So here we are creating our avatar, adding it to the scene, and storing it in this.avatar so that I can potentially do things with it later, like, tint it a different color again. So let's go look at that. And there's our avatar. It's just a square, kind of disappointing. And why is it just a square? It's because it's not playing the animation, right? By default, it doesn't play the animation. By default, it just uses the first frame of the animation. Because in Phaser 3, if we want to animate stuff, we have to specify what the animation is and when to play it and when not to play it, right? So currently we have no animation. We just have the potential for animation because we have these different frames in the sprite sheet. So how are we going to actually animate this thing? Well, there's another subsystem, right? We've seen already that there's like a loader system, and there's a scene management system, and there's an adding system in this.add, for example, and there is an animation system that is specifically built for this kind of a thing. So let's look at how we do this. We can do this from an example, but in the interests of time, and because this is a fairly simple operation that gets done a lot, let's just do this together here. So the way that adding animations works is that we use the animations system, which is this.anims. They couldn't splash out for the full this.animations. They had to call it anims. I guess just for brevity, that's fine. This.anims, and the thing we want to do is we want to create a new animation. And how do we create a new animation? As with many things, we provide a configuration object, right? So the curly brackets, and then we're going to specify a bunch of properties that tell it how to create an animation for this. And what do we provide for information here? Let me just list the basics and explain them. So the first one is the key. Probably won't surprise you that, again, each animation needs a key name so that we can refer to it when we want to play it, for example. I'm going to call it moving because I'm going to play this animation when my sprite is moving around. The next thing that we need to do is we need to tell it what are the frames that make up this animation. The reason for that is because it's quite possible for a sprite sheet to contain more than one animation, right? You might include the walking animation and the jumping animation and the crouching animation and the giving the thumbs up animation and the uncontrollably weeping animation all in the same sprite sheet, and you want to specify different sort of ranges of frames to specify different animation sequences. So there are different ways of doing this, but the easiest way of doing this is to use a helper function that exists in the animation system, which is this.anims.generate frame numbers, because this will go away and actually just figure out how to specify the frames of the animation that we want. What do we tell this method? We tell it the name of the sprite sheet, the key name of the sprite sheet, which is avatar, and again, some configurations. Oh, no, we did not want a semicolon there. Forgive me. We want to specify the starting frame in that sprite sheet, which is 0, the 0th or the first one, and the ending frame in that sprite sheet, which is the 6th one, right? Because we had 7 frames, so starts at 0, ends at 6. This will go away and work out what the frames are that are needed to be specified in the special Phaser 3 language that now we don't have to worry about, which is a relief. So that'll tell it what the frames are of this animation based on that sprite sheet. The next property that's useful is the frame rate. How fast should it play? I'm going to say 30 frames per second. And the final one that's useful is, well, there's other things that are useful, of course, but this is one, is the repeat. Like how many times should this animation repeat? If you specify 0, it won't play, which is sort of super meta and kind of pointless for most animations. If you specify something like 2, it will play 2 times and then stop. If we specify -1, it will loop infinitely, and that is kind of what we want. So that's what we're going to specify, because while the avatar is moving around, I just want it to cycle through this animation over and over again. Okay, so this is going to create that animation called moving, and maybe I should call it avatar moving, I wonder, because it could get confusing otherwise if something else has a moving animation. So I'm going to call it avatar moving. We specify how to calculate what the frames are by giving it the name of the sprite sheet and the starting and ending frame. That way we could put multiple animations into the same sprite sheet. For that we're using this helper function, helper method, generate frame numbers, give it a frame rate and some kind of specification of how often to repeat. So that creates the animation, but currently we're still not playing it, right? We're just creating the potential to play the avatar moving animation with this particular sprite sheet. If we want to actually play it, here things are nice in Phaser 3. The avatar, which is a Phaser 3 sprite, because that's what we created it as, has a method called play, which is for playing animations. And we just specify the name of the animation to play. So avatar moving is the key name, right? So here I'm saying to the avatar, play your avatar moving animation. And it's doing this in create, so it should just kind of start. And there it is. You might decide that's a little too fast. I feel like that's a little too fast. And so you can just adjust the frame rate a bit, maybe down to 24. That's pretty good. I'm happy with that. So it's sort of alert and alive now. It's just playing its animation. It's playing it infinitely because we specified repeat is -1, etc. Hey presto, that worked really well. However, I really only want the avatar to be playing that animation when it's moving, and we're going to talk about moving in the next lesson. So I actually don't want to play avatar moving right now. What I would like is a separate animation that uses the same sprite sheet that will specify when the avatar is not moving. So I'm actually going to basically just duplicate this code to create another animation, and I'm going to call that one avatar idle. It's going to use the same sprite sheet, the avatar sprite sheet, but it's going to start and end at frame 0 so that it's just got the very first frame. And there's no real need for it to repeat, right? Because it doesn't need to play anything. I just want it to have that first frame where it's just a square. And that will be its idling animation. And by default then, the avatar should play its avatar idle animation because at the beginning of my program or game, it's not moving. So then we're playing the idle animation. That just displays the very first frame. And then if this started moving, we know that we could use this avatar.play and then the avatar moving animation, and it would start playing its moving animation as it moved around on the screen. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about next time. The other thing I would suggest is this animation creation process is pretty space consuming. So it's the kind of thing that you might want to tidy off into a method. And I'm going to do that. So I'm going to cut that, and I'm going to imagine I have a method called create animations, and I'm going to create that down here and paste the code in there. That's just to tidy things up, right? The create method was getting a little bit nutty thanks to the sort of vertical length of these animation creation instructions. And this way, I don't need to worry about the animation creation stuff here. If I'm really interested in the specifics, I'll go look in this method down here. So now we have the power to create sprites, both animated and not animated, add them to our scene, play them, stop playing them to our heart's content. So the next thing is let's add some actual movement to the world of the game itself beyond this idea of animation. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next lesson. So I hope you will join me there in the near future. Bye for now.